chosen one? You've felt it your entire life, haven't you? That visceral resistance rising in your chest when someone tells you what to do. That inexplicable defiance when authority figures speak with absolute certainty. While others bow their heads in compliance, something inside you screams no, and you've probably spent years wondering what's wrong with you, why you can't just fall in line like everyone else. But here's the truth they never told you. Nothing is wrong with you. You're a chosen one. And your resistance to authority isn't a flaw. It's a feature. It's not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's your spirit recognizing the difference between divine authority and manufactured control. You see, most people mistake submission for spirituality, but the chosen ones, they know the difference between honoring true wisdom and enabling corruption. Think about the great prophets of the Bible. Moses defied Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the known world. Jeremiah challenged the kings and priests of Judah. Daniel refused to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. Were they rebels? Or were they aligned with a higher authority that the masses couldn't see? Your struggle with earthly authority isn't disobedience, it's discernment. It's your soul refusing to trade divine guidance for human control. The religious leaders of Jesus' time had all the credentials, all the titles, all the societal power, yet Jesus called them whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside but full of dead men's bones. Why? Because authority without truth is just tyranny with a title. And your spirit knows this instinctively. You weren't made to follow blindly. You were made to follow truth, even when truth stands alone against the crowd. If this resonates with your journey, do me a favor right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel exists to help chosen ones like you understand their path, and your support through a super thanks helps me continue creating this content that speaks to your soul. Listen closely. The system needs you to doubt your discernment. It needs you to believe that your resistance is a character flaw that needs fixing. Because the moment you realize that your questioning is actually divine wisdom, the moment you understand that your refusal to comply is spiritual clarity, you become ungovernable by false authority. And that terrifies the structures that rely on blind obedience. Your struggle with authority figures isn't something to overcome, it's something to understand. Because once you understand it, you'll stop trying to fix yourself and start recognizing your assignment. You're not here to fit into broken systems. You're here to expose them, transcend them, and ultimately help others break free from them. Every chosen one carries a specific spiritual frequency that operates fundamentally differently from the collective consciousness. While most people are wired for social conformity, genetically programmed to seek approval from the tribe, you carry the DNA of the prophets. This isn't metaphorical. This is spiritual reality embedded in the very fabric of your soul. Scripture tells us in Jeremiah 1:5, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Notice the language here. Set you apart. Not integrated you, not blended you with the masses. Set you apart. Your separation from conventional authority structures isn't a bug in your programming. It's the entire point of your design. From the moment you entered this world, you've been different. You questioned things other children accepted. You saw through manipulations that fooled everyone else. You felt uncomfortable in hierarchies that others navigated effortlessly. Teachers, parents, bosses, even religious leaders, they've all sensed something in you that doesn't quite submit the way it should. And they've probably tried to break that part of you, haven't they? But here's what they didn't understand. What they perceived as stubbornness was actually sovereignty. What looked like defiance was discernment. Your spirit recognizes that human authority is conditional, temporary, and often corrupted by ego and power. Meanwhile, divine authority is absolute, eternal, and rooted in unconditional love. You weren't made to bow to the former while pretending it's the latter. Think about how Jesus operated. He was constantly at odds with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Roman authorities, basically everyone in power. Why? Because he answered to a higher authority. He said in John 5:30, "I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me." This is the chosen one's operating system. Direct connection to divine will, bypassing human intermediaries who claim to speak for God. Your DNA contains this same blueprint. You're hardwired to receive revelation directly from source. This makes you incredibly threatening to any system that positions itself as the necessary middleman between you and God. Religious institutions, corporate hierarchies, governmental structures, they all rely on the belief that you need them to access truth, resources, or salvation. Your very existence challenges this lie. The Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2:14-15, "The person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them foolishness, and cannot understand them because they are discerned spiritually. The person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments." Read that last part again. Not subject to merely human judgments. This is your spiritual inheritance. There's a cosmic difference between authority and authenticity, and chosen ones feel this distinction in their bones. Authority says, "Obey me because of my position." Authenticity says, "Trust me because of my alignment with truth." The world runs on authority. The kingdom operates on authenticity. And you, dear chosen one, were coded for the kingdom, which is why worldly authority structures feel suffocating to your soul. Jesus demonstrated this perfectly. Matthew 7:28-29 tells us, "When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority, and not as their teachers of the law." Notice the contrast. The religious leaders had positional authority, credentials, titles, institutional backing. Jesus had authentic authority, truth that resonated with the deepest part of the human spirit. One came from external validation, the other from internal alignment with divine truth. You recognize authentic authority immediately. It doesn't need to announce itself, demand respect, or threaten consequences for non-compliance. It simply is, radiating truth so powerfully that recognition is automatic. But false authority, it's loud, insecure, constantly reminding you of its credentials and your obligation to submit. It uses fear, guilt, and manipulation as tools of control, and your spirit rejects it violently because you were made to follow the shepherd's voice, not the barking of wolves in shepherd's clothing. This is why you've probably struggled in churches, corporate jobs, even family structures where toxic authority demanded submission. Without earning trust, you've been labeled rebellious, difficult, unteachable, when in reality, you're simply unwilling to honor inauthenticity with your obedience. You instinctively know that submitting to corrupt authority makes you complicit in the oppression of others who don't yet have the strength to resist. Consider David's relationship with King Saul. David honored the position of king and refused to harm Saul even when he had opportunity, but he also refused to stay in Saul's court and be destroyed by Saul's jealous rage. David understood that you can respect an office without subjecting yourself to abuse from the person occupying it. This is wisdom the chosen ones carry. The ability to honor what is honorable while refusing to enable what is destructive. The world will tell you that all authority comes from God and must be obeyed. They'll quote Romans 13 about submitting to governing authorities while conveniently ignoring the context, ignoring that the same Paul, who wrote those words, was regularly imprisoned for defying unjust laws, ignoring that the early Christians were martyred specifically because they refused to acknowledge Caesar's ultimate authority. Blind submission to earthly authority isn't biblical, it's bondage. True spiritual maturity means discerning which authorities align with divine will and which ones oppose it. It means following leaders who serve while exposing leaders who exploit. Your discomfort with authority isn't a wound to heal, it's a radar to trust. It keeps you from drinking poisoned water from broken wells while everyone around you pretends it tastes pure. Let's talk about what I call the Pharaoh Complex. The pattern of authority that enslaves rather than empowers, that builds empires on the backs of those who serve, that sees people as resources to exploit rather than souls to elevate. This complex is alive and thriving in modern systems, and your spirit recognizes it instantly, which is exactly why you struggle to function within these structures. Pharaoh didn't see himself as evil. He saw himself as God, as the rightful ruler, as someone maintaining necessary order. When Moses said, "Let my people go," Pharaoh genuinely couldn't comprehend why the slaves would want to leave. After all, he provided them with work, structure, purpose, and survival. Sound familiar? How many jobs, institutions, and even churches operate with this exact mentality today? The Pharaoh Complex reveals itself through specific patterns. First, it demands increasing productivity without increasing value given in return. The Israelites had to make bricks without being provided straw, then were blamed for not meeting quotas. Modern workers face the same reality. Do more with less. Be grateful you have a job. Your exhaustion is your problem, not ours. Second, it punishes those who question the system. When Moses first approached Pharaoh, the workload increased as retribution. How many times have you experienced backlash for asking legitimate questions or suggesting improvements? Third, and most insidiously, the Pharaoh Complex creates psychological dependence. Even after the plagues, even after witnessing God's power, many Israelites wanted to return to Egypt when freedom got difficult. They'd been so thoroughly conditioned that slavery felt safer than sovereignty. This is why leaving toxic jobs, churches, or relationships feels terrifying even when you know they're destroying you. The system has trained you to fear your own freedom. You, as a chosen one, have the same assignment Moses had, to call people out of these systems. But first you had to recognize the systems for what they are. This is why you've struggled so deeply with authority figures who embody the Pharaoh Complex. Your spirit literally cannot submit to this energy because submission would mean betraying your divine assignment. Jesus addressed this directly in Matthew 20:25-26. You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Notice Jesus doesn't say all authority is wrong. He says lording authority is wrong. He contrasts worldly power structures with kingdom principles. True leadership serves. It doesn't enslave. Every institution infected with the Pharaoh Complex will perceive you as a threat, because your freedom consciousness challenges their control paradigm. They need you to believe that you need them, that you can't survive or succeed or reach God without their mediation. Your very existence as someone who connects directly to divine wisdom, who thrives outside their approval systems, who refuses to trade authenticity for acceptance. This existence is revolutionary. Understanding the Pharaoh Complex helps you stop personalizing the resistance you face from authority figures. It's not about you specifically. It's about what you represent: liberation, truth, direct access to God, and the obsolescence of corrupt middlemen. Pharaoh didn't hate Moses personally. He hated what Moses represented: the end of his empire. After leaving Egypt, the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. This wasn't punishment, it was purification. They needed those decades to unlearn slave mentality, to stop looking to human authority for survival, to learn to follow the cloud by day and the fire by night. Every chosen one goes through this wilderness season, and it's often the most painful period of your life because everything you were taught about authority gets completely dismantled. In the wilderness, you can't rely on bosses, institutions, traditional career paths, or even religious structures the way you once did. God systematically removes every false source of security to teach you that He alone is your provider, protector, and guide. The manna came daily, teaching them present-moment trust instead of hoarding and control. The water came from rocks, teaching them that provision comes from impossible sources when you're aligned with divine will. This is why your relationship with authority figures becomes so strained during wilderness seasons. You're being recalibrated to hear God's voice as your primary authority, which means every human voice, no matter how loud or credentialed, becomes secondary. Bosses who once intimidated you lose their power. Religious leaders who once seemed infallible reveal their clay feet. Family members who controlled you through guilt find their manipulation no longer works. But here's what makes the wilderness so disorienting. Everyone watching from the outside thinks you're failing. You're not climbing corporate ladders. You're not impressing the right people. You're not building the visible empire that society respects. You look lost, directionless, maybe even backslidden to religious observers. Meanwhile, internally, you're undergoing the most important transformation of your life, learning to hear the voice that matters above all others. Elijah experienced this in 1 Kings 19 after his great victory over the prophets of Baal. Jezebel's threat sent him running to the wilderness, depressed and suicidal. God didn't rebuke him for this. Instead, God sent an angel with food, let him sleep, and then met him in a cave. God wasn't in the earthquake, wind, or fire that people expected. God was in the still, small voice. Elijah had to get away from all the loud voices, all the demanding authorities, all the expectations, to hear the whisper that would reorient his entire life. Your wilderness is teaching you this same lesson. The authority you're learning to follow doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't manipulate. It whispers, it invites, it guides. And you can only hear it when you've created enough distance from the noisy, demanding voices of worldly authority structures. This is why isolation often accompanies awakening. You're not being punished. You're being protected while your spiritual ears are recalibrated. During this season, you'll be tempted to rush back to Egypt, to submit to authorities just to make the discomfort stop, to get validation from systems you know are broken just to feel normal again. Resist this with everything in you. The wilderness is temporary. The freedom you're cultivating is eternal. You're not learning to reject all authority. You're learning to recognize true authority, and that changes everything. Let's address something crucial. Your struggle with authority figures isn't just about your personal freedom. It's about your prophetic mandate. God positions chosen ones in specific proximity to corrupt systems, not so you can conform to them, but so you can expose them, challenge them, and call people out of them. This is uncomfortable work, which is why most people avoid their calling. But you weren't built to avoid it. Look at every prophet in Scripture. Nathan confronted King David about his adultery and murder. Elijah challenged the entire religious and governmental system under Ahab and Jezebel. John the Baptist called out Herod's immorality publicly, which cost him his life. Jeremiah spent decades prophesying against the corruption in Jerusalem's temple and palace, enduring imprisonment and attempts on his life. The prophetic call has always involved confronting authority that has strayed from righteousness. Jesus' harshest words weren't for prostitutes or tax collectors. They were for the religious authorities of his day. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. Matthew 23:15. That's not gentle Jesus, meek and mild. That's righteous rage against authorities who use their position to spiritually abuse people. This is part of your DNA as a chosen one. You carry the same mandate. When you see leaders exploiting their congregations financially while preaching prosperity, when you see bosses creating toxic environments while demanding loyalty, when you see institutions covering up abuse while maintaining their image, when you see systems oppressing the vulnerable while calling it order, your spirit rises up in resistance because you're meant to be a voice for those who haven't found theirs yet. This is why staying silent feels like death to you. It's not dramatics, it's not ego, it's your spirit recognizing that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit. Proverbs 31:8-9 commands, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy." This isn't optional for chosen ones. This is assignment. But here's the hard part. This calling will cost you. Nathan could have been executed for confronting David. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern and left to die. John the Baptist was beheaded. Jesus was crucified. The prophetic path has never been safe or popular. You will lose relationships, opportunities, platforms, and respect from people who worship at the altar of corrupt authority. The question is, what matters more, their approval or your assignment? You've probably already experienced this cost. Jobs you've lost for speaking truth. Churches you've had to leave for refusing to participate in spiritual manipulation. Relationships that ended because you wouldn't enable dysfunction anymore. Family members who called you divisive for setting boundaries. Each loss felt devastating in the moment, but look closer. You were being freed from alliances that would have compromised your calling. Your prophetic mandate isn't about being judgmental or self-righteous. It's about loving people, enough to tell them the truth even when lies would be more comfortable. It's about valuing their souls more than their temporary approval. It's about representing God's heart for justice, especially for those crushed by corrupt authority. This is why you can't just fall in line. Falling in line would mean abandoning those counting on you to be a voice of truth. There's a dangerous pattern that happens when chosen Ones get weary of waiting on God's timing and submit to human authority to speed up their destiny. I call it the Ishmael effect, named after Abraham's decision to produce an heir through Hagar instead of waiting for God's promise through Sarah. The fruit looks right, but it's premature, produced through human effort under human authority rather than divine timing under divine guidance. Genesis 16 shows us this pattern. Sarah, then Sarai, told Abraham to sleep with her servant Hagar because she was tired of waiting on God's promise. Abraham submitted to Sarah's authority, his wife's directive. They produced Ishmael, but Ishmael wasn't the promised son. He was the product of impatience, of listening to human wisdom over divine instruction. And that decision created conflict that still reverberates thousands of years later. How many times have you been pressured by authority figures? People who claim to know better, who have more experience, who seem more connected, to take actions that feel misaligned with your spirit. Maybe it was a business decision that seemed smart, but felt wrong. Maybe it was a relationship everyone told you to pursue that you knew wasn't right. Maybe it was a career path that looked impressive but drained your soul. This is the Ishmael effect, producing outcomes through obedience to external authority that God never ordained. The tragedy is that Ishmael wasn't evil or worthless. God blessed him, but he still wasn't Isaac, the promised son who came years later when Abraham and Sarah were both too old for it to be anything but miraculous. Isaac represents what God births through you when you wait on his authority, his timing, his methods. Isaac doesn't require striving or manipulating or submitting to human schemes. Isaac flows from alignment. You've probably got some Ishmaels in your life right now. Projects you started because some mentor pressured you. Relationships you formed because someone in authority said you should. Directions you took because you got tired of looking foolish for waiting on God. These Ishmaels aren't necessarily bad, but maintaining them is exhausting because they require constant human effort to sustain what God never initiated. Here's the painful part. Sometimes God requires you to release your Ishmaels before He'll bring your Isaac. As long as you're pouring energy into what human authority convinced you to create, you don't have capacity for what divine authority wants to birth. Abraham had to send Ishmael away, a heartbreaking decision, before Isaac could become the clear heir of the promise. What human authority convinced you to create might need to be released for God's true promise to manifest. This is one reason why chosen ones struggle so intensely with authority figures. Your spirit knows the difference between Ishmael energy and Isaac energy. You can feel when someone is trying to get you to force something that God hasn't ordained. You resist because you've learned, often through painful experience, that submitting to human pressure produces fruit that looks right but feels wrong, that requires constant maintenance instead of flowing naturally, that ultimately delays the real promise. Galatians 4:22-23 explains, "For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by the slave woman and the other by the free woman. His son by the slave woman was born according to the flesh, but his son by the free woman was born as the result of a divine promise." One birth was human effort, under human authority. The other was divine promise under divine timing. Your life is meant to be full of Isaac births, not Ishmael striving, and that requires you to stop submitting to authorities who pressure you to force what God hasn't ordained. It's time to make a critical distinction. Rejecting worldly authority structures doesn't mean you reject all authority. It means you've graduated to recognizing kingdom authority, which operates completely differently. Jesus said in Matthew 28:18, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." All authority. This means every legitimate authority on earth is delegated authority, derivative of Christ's ultimate authority, and must align with his character and purposes to be valid. Kingdom authority empowers. It doesn't dominate. It serves. It doesn't exploit. It multiplies. It doesn't hoard. It liberates. It doesn't enslave. When you encounter true kingdom authority in a person, whether they're a pastor, boss, teacher, or leader, you recognize it immediately because it feels nothing like worldly control. It calls forth your greatness instead of requiring your smallness. It celebrates your growth instead of feeling threatened by it. Jesus demonstrated this leadership style constantly. He washed his disciples' feet. He touched lepers. He elevated women in a patriarchal society. He honored children when culture dismissed them. He told his followers, "I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends." John 15:15. This is revolutionary. Kingdom authority doesn't create master-slave dynamics. It creates partnerships where the leader is actually the greatest servant. This is the authority you're actually willing to submit to, isn't it? When you encounter someone who genuinely serves, who uses their influence to elevate others, who operates with humility and transparency, who admits mistakes and values truth over image, your resistance dissolves. You're not against authority. You're against the corruption of authority, the perversion of it into control, mechanisms that serve the leader's ego instead of the people's well-being. Paul understood this distinction perfectly. He had authority as an apostle, yet he wrote in 2 Corinthians 1:24, "Not that we lord it over your faith, but we work with you for your joy, because it is by faith you stand firm." Notice, work with you, not over you. Kingdom authority sees itself as a co-laborer, not a dictator. It recognizes that everyone has direct access to God and therefore must work out their own faith. The struggle you have with authority figures is usually because they're operating in worldly control paradigms while claiming to represent kingdom authority. They demand submission while displaying pride. They require loyalty while demonstrating betrayal. They preach servanthood while building personal empires. Your spirit rejects this hypocrisy violently because it's not just wrong, it's blasphemy, taking God's name and attaching it to satanic power structures. Satan's original rebellion was about authority. He wanted to ascend above the heights of the clouds and make myself like the Most High. Isaiah 14:14. Every worldly authority system that exalts itself, that demands worship or unquestioning obedience, that crushes those beneath it to elevate itself, is operating in this same satanic paradigm. Your refusal to submit to it isn't rebellion. It's spiritual warfare. You're refusing to give allegiance to the enemy's counterfeit just because it wears religious or professional clothing. When you align with kingdom authority, divine order flows through your life naturally. You honor those who deserve honor. You submit where submission serves love and truth. You follow leaders who actually lead by example. But you're immune to manipulation from those who use authority as a weapon, who demand submission as tribute to their ego, who build kingdoms for themselves while claiming to serve God's kingdom. One of the most painful aspects of being a chosen one who struggles with authority is the profound isolation it creates. You can't fit into most organizational structures. You can't participate in groupthink. You can't network your way to success in systems that require you to compromise your integrity for advancement. This isolation isn't punishment, though it often feels like it. It's divine protection, ensuring you stay uncorrupted for the assignment ahead. Joseph experienced this acutely. His own brothers, the ultimate authority figures in his young life, tried to kill him and then sold him into slavery. In Egypt, he was enslaved, then imprisoned on false charges despite doing everything right. Years of isolation, years of having every earthly authority either betray him or fail him. But that isolation protected his character, refined his gifts, and positioned him perfectly for the moment when Pharaoh would need someone who answered to a higher authority than political convenience. If Joseph had been able to succeed through normal channels, networking with the right Egyptians, playing political games, compromising his integrity to get ahead, he would have been corrupted by the time Pharaoh's dream needed interpreting. His isolation ensured he stayed dependent on God alone, hearing clearly, operating with pure motives. The same is true for you. The doors that closed, the networks that rejected you, the authorities who misunderstood you, all of it was divine protection. David spent years isolated in caves, running from King Saul, unable to claim the throne he'd already been anointed to rule. Those cave years weren't wasted time. They were where he wrote Psalms, where he learned to lead the misfits and outcasts who joined him, where he matured from an impulsive young man into a king after God's own heart. If he'd been able to take the throne prematurely through human authority structures, by assassinating Saul or leading a coup, he would have built his kingdom on bloodshed and betrayal instead of on God's timing and character. Your isolation is doing the same work. Every time you couldn't advance because you wouldn't play political games, your integrity deepened. Every time you lost an opportunity because you wouldn't compromise, your alignment strengthened. Every time you were rejected by authorities who wanted to control you, your connection to divine authority grew clearer. The isolation hasn't been blocking your destiny, it's been protecting it, incubating it, ensuring that when you do step into your assignment, you're uncorrupted enough to handle it. Hebrews 11:37-38 describes faithful ones who went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. The world didn't deserve them. Read that again. Their isolation wasn't because they weren't good enough for the world. It was because the world wasn't worthy of what they carried. The same is true for you. This isolation also serves another purpose. It forces you to develop direct communication with God. When you can't rely on pastors to hear God for you, you learn to hear Him yourself. When you can't depend on bosses to validate your worth, you discover your value in God's eyes. When you can't fit into ready-made communities, you learn to be content in divine companionship. The isolation that feels like rejection is actually initiation into a level of intimacy with God that crowd followers never experience. Yes, it's lonely. Yes, it's painful. Yes, you'll have moments where you question if you're doing something wrong, if you should just submit to authorities and make life easier. But remember, John the Baptist prepared for his ministry in the wilderness, eating locusts and honey. Jesus began his ministry with 40 days in the desert, alone except for the devil's temptations and angels ministering. Every major biblical figure experienced profound isolation before profound assignment. Your loneliness is proof you're on the right path, not the wrong one. Now we arrive at the ultimate truth. You struggle with authority figures because you were never meant to indefinitely submit to them. You were meant to grow into your own authority, to become the voice that speaks truth, to lead from a place of authentic kingdom power. Your resistance to corrupt authority wasn't just protective, it was preparatory. Everything you've learned about what leadership shouldn't be is teaching you what it should be. Moses spent 40 years in Pharaoh's palace learning how empire operates, then 40 years in the wilderness unlearning it, before he could step into his authority to lead the Exodus. You've been through a similar process. You've seen how broken systems function. You've experienced how corrupt authority operates. You've recognized the patterns that exploit people while claiming to help them. This wasn't accidental. You were being educated, shown exactly what not to replicate when you step into leadership. Because here's what you need to understand. Your calling isn't to perpetually rebel against authority from the margins. It's to embody true authority that others can finally trust and follow. You're being prepared to lead, to teach, to guide others on the path you've walked. The people coming behind you need someone who understands their struggle with authority, who won't abuse the position, who will serve rather than dominate. You're becoming that person. Luke 12:48 tells us, "From everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded, and from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked." You've been given much. Revelation about corrupt systems, understanding of kingdom principles, direct connection to divine guidance, courage to stand alone, integrity refined through isolation. Now comes the responsibility, using these gifts to serve others, to build kingdom structures that operate nothing like worldly systems. This is terrifying, isn't it? Because you know intimately how authority can be corrupted, how power can seduce, how leadership can become about the leader instead of the lead. You're afraid of becoming what you've resisted, but that fear is actually your qualification. Leaders who don't fear corruption are most susceptible to it. Leaders who understand how easy it is to abuse authority are most likely to steward it well. Jesus said in Matthew 23:11-12, "The greatest among you will be your servant, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted." This is your blueprint. Your authority won't look like worldly authority because it's not meant to. It won't be about titles, credentials, or commanding obedience. It will be about serving so genuinely, speaking truth so consistently, and embodying love so radically that people naturally want to follow your example. You're not being called to build an empire. You're being called to build a family, not to create hierarchy but community, not to demand submission but to invite partnership, not to lord over others but to wash their feet. while showing them who they truly are in Christ. This is authority that doesn't trigger the resistance you felt your entire life, because it's not counterfeit control masquerading as leadership. It's genuine kingdom power that liberates instead of enslaves. The world is full of wounded people who've been destroyed by corrupt authority figures. They're desperate for leaders they can actually trust, for authority that doesn't abuse, for guidance that genuinely serves their well-being, instead of using them for someone else's agenda. You've been uniquely prepared to be this for them. Every painful experience with bad authority taught you exactly what these wounded people need. Someone who understands their caution, honors their autonomy, and serves their growth without exploitation. So step into it. Stop hiding behind your struggle with authority and recognize it was preparation for embodying true authority. Stop seeing yourself as perpetually resistant and start seeing yourself as redemptively revolutionary. You're not here to tear down everything and leave rubble. You're here to tear down what's broken and build something beautiful in its place, something that actually reflects God's heart for humanity. Your struggle with authority figures was never the problem. It was the awakening. Now comes the assignment. Become the authority figure you always needed, but never had. Lead the way you wished you'd been led. Serve the way you long to be served. Build the kingdom structures that honor people instead of using them. This is what chosen ones do. Not rebel for rebellion's sake, but reconstruct for redemption's sake. The world doesn't need more people who blindly submit to broken systems. It needs people who've survived those systems, learned their lessons, and emerged with enough integrity and courage to build something different. That's you. That's your calling. That's why you struggled with authority, so you could ultimately embody the kind of authority that heals instead of harms, that liberates instead of enslaves, that reflects Jesus instead of Pharaoh. Now go. Your isolation season is ending. Your authority season is beginning, and everyone who's been waiting for a leader they can finally trust is about to discover that you were worth the wait.